This is our 13th episode of GAAP Chats. In this episode, we'll provide you with an update on some topics and issues we've been discussing in recent podcasts, including Credit Suisse, Coinbase, held-to-maturity debt securities, and buy now, pay later companies. We'll also discuss some of the latest developments in U.S. GAAP by looking at two exposure drafts issued by the FASB related to income tax disclosures and accounting for crypto assets. We'll also look at a new ASU related to common control lease arrangements. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Welcome to GAAP Chats, the podcast dedicated to all things accounting, brought to you by GAAP Dynamics. I'm your host, Mike Walworth, and with me as always is my faithful partner, Chris Brundrett. We hope you'll join us on our journey today as we share our passion for accounting and help change the way you train. Well, Chris, we've made it to our 13th episode.
Yikes. I hope nothing bad happens. And I just realized, Mike, not only is there our 13th episode, but it's Friday.
Yeah.
It's not Friday the 13th. It's Friday the 31st. If you flip those numbers around, uh-oh.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm kind of happy today. You want to know
You're
why?
happy?
Yeah, you want to know why? You know
Why?
why. You know why.
You like the number 13.
Well,
Isn't
I
that
like
why?
I like the number 13. It's Friday. We record
Yeah.
these things on Friday for
Right.
our listeners here. I'm about to go on spring break with my family. Well, my
good.
wife and one of my kids.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on spring break with them. We're going to learn how to surf. So hopefully I can get my fat butt up on the surfboard.
All
Not
right.
look like a total dig. And then
Please send some videos, right? That'll be good. I'd like to hear that. I'd like to see that. So 13, right?
Okay.
Let's get back to 13. Now, I know you like the number 13. You've always said that, but why do you like the number 13? Because most people don't.
Yeah, it's funny. It was my. I don't know why I actually like it. It was my high school football number. But I know a lot of people, they don't like it. Have you noticed? I was doing some research on 13. Have you noticed that, like on a high-rise building, they usually don't have the 13th floor?
Yeah, quite often there is no 13th floor. So interesting. I mean, it's definitely got some, superstition about it. Let's say that.
Well, I kind of did some research. I'm like, why? Why 13? Right. And so this is what, Wikipedia had to say. So the first thing is it's the end of the Mayan calendar's 13th Baktun, which was feared as a harbinger of the apocalyptic 2012 phenomena. So if you remember back in 2012, people thought the end of the world, well, that was due to the Mayans, and that was their 13th Baktun, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Obviously, we talk about Jesus had 12 disciples. Well, there was actually 13 disciples. And of course, that was Judas, and we know what that guy did. And then this was interesting. On Friday, and probably this is where we get to Friday the 13th. On Friday, October 13th, 13,007, so way back when, this is the Middle Ages, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of the Knight Templars, and most of the knights were either tortured or killed. So I think that's kind of why that 13 is a bad number.
So a little more to it than the Friday the 13th franchise that we all know from growing up in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
So it is weird how different cultures have different superstitions around this stuff. Now, I don't think the number 13 is bad in all cultures, right?
No, I think actually like 13 in France was considered lucky or whatever, and I know that there's different lucky numbers and different unlucky numbers. And I remember it brings up a stupid story actually, but I want to tell it. Like 4 in China, the number 4 is considered a bad number, and I guess it's because in Mandarin when you pronounce the word 4. Mm-hmm. It sounds like the word death.
Okay.
And so, but funny story about China. I got to tell this story. So Picture this. I mean, we're back. What was it? It must have been when we started GAAP Dynamics maybe 2-3 years after, right? So you're 2003 or 4 or 5, something like 2004, I think. So I went to China, and we back in the day, before COVID, we even stopped teaching as much, but we used to fly all around the world. I know you would go to Brazil. Where was your favorite place to ever go?
Argentina was up there, right? I always loved South America. So Argentina, Brazil was great. Mexico, that's not South America, but we used to do a lot of teaching in Mexico. Always loved going down there as well. Of course, I mean, Europe and all over. I mean, there are lots of good places. But you used to go to China quite a bit. I went one time, but you went quite a bit.
So I remember the very first time I went to China, and I'm like, kind of all freaked out and whatever. And so I went, and back in the day, this was before kids, and I think I was still living in Switzerland at the time, so it might have been 2003. I remember I used to take Jeannie on these trips with me. I'd pay for Jeannie, and then the client obviously would pay for me to go. And I remember Jeannie, the only time she went to China, she was pregnant with Jackson. So that would have been in the summer. So she was like 6 months pregnant with Jackson. And so she came, and I think we went a little early, and she was going to see kind of Beijing with me or whatever. And then she was going to fly home by herself, and I would do the gig. Anyway, we checked in, and I think it was called like the China World Trade Center. And it was kind of nice hotel, whatever. My client put us up. And I went to check in, Chris, and I remember the guy gave me the keys, and he was, and I won't do any impressions because I don't want to get canceled, right? But basically the dude said, "Okay, here's your key, Mr. Walworth," and he gave me the room key, and it was room 666.
Oh gosh.
and I looked at him, and Jeannie kind of looked at me. I kind of looked at Jeannie. I said, "Yeah, I can't take that." And he was like, "Why not? It's a very good room, sir. It's on the 6th floor, and it's a very good view." Whatever. I'm like, "No, I just can't take it. It's a bad number for Christians. It's a bad number in my culture." He's like, I don't understand. He didn't understand. I was like, it's kind of like the number 4. Oh, no, 4 for you, right? 4 is a bad number. He's like, he still didn't understand. He's like, I don't understand. What's the matter? 666. And I actually did this. I actually put my 2 fingers above my head like the devil. And I'm like, it's the devil's number. Ah! And I actually did that in the lobby of this hotel. And so I always get a big kick out of that. My wife was like, "You're crazy."
Did you get another room?
I did get another room.
Okay. But they still think you're crazy. Right?
They thought I was insane. But anyway.
All right. That is a good story, and I'm glad you shared that with us on Friday, our 13th episode. But let's talk about US GAAP, and let's talk about things new in US GAAP.
All right. So we'll definitely get to that. I wanted to provide our listeners with an update on some of the issues we've been discussing in recent episodes. So let's do that. Let's do that first, and then we'll get to the US GAAP. So I want to kind of go in reverse order, starting with kind of the most recent episode. So last week, you and I, right, discussed sort of the accounting for held to maturity debt securities. And so after that episode, I'm like, Jenny reminded me, you got a blog to do. And I'm like, oh, great. What am I going to write about? And so I kind of got down this rabbit hole this past weekend and sort of had me reviewing the 10Ks. And I was trying to see, basically my premise was this. I was like, I wonder how much U.S. banks held to maturity. Because I don't know, you and I mean, we might have discussed it, but I always sort of teach it like that category is sort of, I don't want to say it's off limits, but you're kind of handcuffed because you can't sell stuff.
Sure.
And at least in the recent past, you and I mean, if you go look at banks, most of them had done a lot of available for sale, right? Held to maturity was kind of small. But I had this theory that banks might be using it more than they did. So I got down the rabbit hole. I figured out the top 25 banks in the U.S. And you know what I found? After reviewing the 10Ks for all 25 banks, that's what I did this weekend.
Yeah, that's good fun.
Yeah, great. I found that most of them substantially increased the proportion of their investments classified as held to maturity. And I wrote a blog on it, and it was published one day before a similar piece with a lot less data, I might add, was published by the Wall Street Journal. And
Interesting.
That is interesting. So I was down the right. I mean, it was timely and whatever. I even had a reporter from Bloomberg kind of email me and saying how much she liked the post. So that was just a little, kudos to me, pat on my back. Anyway, I'll put the link to the blog in the podcast. So that's the first thing.
So if we're going backwards, then the next one. So that's a good and interesting update. But going backwards, then it was the podcast before that was Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse and all that stuff.
Yeah,
right?
have you been keeping up with that?
Yeah, a little bit.
So what's happened with those things?
Well, I mean, so since that episode, right? The banking regulators in the U.S. and Switzerland forced the sale of both banks, right? So First Citizens, probably people have heard the news. They're buying SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. And then UBS is buying Credit Suisse. So let's just say the terms of the deals were less than ideal for the shareholders of these entities, but basically these other banks are kind of bailing them out, right?
Yeah. I saw the Credit Suisse UBS thing, and what's interesting is that is, I don't know that Switzerland has. Well, I guess at this point they probably do have these rules like monopolies or those kinds of things in Switzerland, but they didn't have a choice, right? There's two big banks in Switzerland, and they were UBS and Credit Suisse, and from what I heard, basically the banking regulator just looked at UBS and said, "You are buying them, and here's the price," and literally the shareholders are wiped out.
Kind of like that whole Bank of America Merrill Lynch deal deal that went on during the credit crisis, all those years ago. But, in the US, I guess the good news for the deposit holders at SVB that First Citizens, took them over and, really, the branches are still open. They just changed the sign. So, I mean, crisis, somewhat averted, I guess, by that. Certainly was a rough time, but hopefully, the things will work out there.
Yeah.
But, all right. So going back another week, we got Coinbase. You were talking all about, I was out. That was you and Bob. You were talking all about that.
That's where I did the crazy Davy Jones.
The Kraken thing.
The Kraken. Yeah. Anyway, so in that episode, we talked about Kraken's enforcement action from the SEC. Mm-hmm. It was a $30 million fine, and they agreed to kind of close their staking as a service program and sort of shut it down, because basically the SEC said it was like securities lending, and therefore if it's like securities, you're under the auspices, you're under the regulation of the SEC. Well, we talked about Coinbase, and they're like the number 2 exchange, and their CEO, he kind of had a bravado, bring it on attitude with the SEC, and I think Bob and I were kind of saying, I wonder how that's going to work out for you. Well, guess what? He effed around, and guess what? He found out, because last week the SEC issued a Wells notice indicating that they intend to recommend an enforcement action against the company. Coinbase's shares fell promptly 15%. I guess the moral story is don't mess with the SEC. What's interesting is I just read today, Binance, which is the largest one, they're also in some trouble with the CFTC and some other things. So literally all those regulators are really, really, really kind of coming back and trying to get, I think after FTX, I think they're trying to get all those people under some sort of regulation. So yeah. And the last one I want to talk about, do you remember when we did buy now, pay later?
Yeah, sure.
And I thought that was kind of cool because neither you or I really realized people were doing this, right? And so if you remember in that episode, I think, Chris, we talked about kind of some of the main players. I think it was Affirm, it was Afterpay, and maybe Klarna. And we sort of talked about how much that thing has grown, right? The market.
I've started noticing now, like since we did that and we were researching it, like, now I pay attention, like where it's like, okay, how do you want to pay? Do you want to pay credit card, PayPal, and then it's, some buy now, pay later option.
Yeah.
Right? And PayPal has their own.
Yeah, so. Right. And I think we even mentioned this in this podcast, that it was because that market had grown so much, some big players were thinking about entering it. Yeah. And actually, a couple days ago, we're recording this on Friday, March 31st. Literally 2 days ago, it was announced that Apple Pay is entering, or Apple's entering it, and it's called Apple Pay Later, allowing Apple Pay users to split purchases into 4 payments with 0 interest and no fees.
They're not going to call it Rotten Apple?
That's a good one. No, yeah. Day, 4 day off.
Right.
4
week old Apple.
No. Yeah. No. But what's interesting is, I mean, you're talking about, I think Apple is the largest company in the world. I think it has, tons of cash, right? I mean, I think they if you took their balance sheet, they have, the GDP of, probably all but 10 nations in the world. I mean, so I don't know that Affirm, Afterpay, and Klarna are going to, it's one thing to take on competitors. It's another thing to take on the king, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
It'll be interesting. I also kind of, when we did this, I kind of looked at some research. I said, buy now, pay later news. And I guess it was Market Watch, an article, basically said in the first 2 months of 2023, the share of online grocery orders made using buy now, pay later grew by 40%. Over the prior year. And so I ask you, Chris, I mean, when people are doing buy now, pay later for their groceries, is that's
scary. That's scary. And I mean, but we've seen such an increase in food prices. I understand that the challenge, but that's, that starts to get scary of a path you go down you can't get out of.
So I mean, maybe it's trouble from the economy. I mean, maybe it's a kind of Ricky Bobby type thing. Hang on, baby Jesus, it's about to get bumpy.
All right. Well, on that great, Talladega Nights quote, can we get down to U.S. GAAP? I mean, those were great updates, and I appreciate it, but I'm really excited to talk about GAAP and some changes that are going on here.
PCAOB inspections and the associated inspection reports can bring stress to audit engagement teams everywhere. If you want to improve your team's audit quality and reduce the number of potential deficiencies in your reports, GAAP Dynamics can help. Join us for our upcoming webinar, Improving Audit Quality, on Tuesday, April 25th, 2023 at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's free to register, and you'll hear directly from PCAOB inspectors about risk assessment, internal controls, supervision, and review. And the best part, you can receive up to 1.5 hours of CPE credit. Register now at gapdynamics.com. That's Gap with 2 A's, dynamics.com, or simply click the link in the description. Hope to see you there.
All right, so we had talked about, we're going to talk about 2 exposure drafts and then 1 new ASU. Okay, so that's kind of what's new. So I don't know about you, but I remember when we first started, so when did you start with us? 2006? 2006. And but even probably when you joined, like you notice we never really talk about exposure drafts in our US GAAP update, right? And there's a reason for that, because I remember when we first started, and I started with Richard, we'd have all these exposure drafts. This is what the FASB's thinking. This is what the ISB thinking. And I was like, it's just too much, Richard. There's too much real GAAP to worry about.
Right.
Getting into this sort of what's happening? And because exposure drafts can kind of change. And so we've never really focused on them. I mean, you and I read them. I mean, we know what's going on and I can talk intelligently about it, but certainly I never wanted to put in a training. I just think there's too much other stuff to worry about. But I thought about it and I was like, this podcast gives us a perfect medium to sort of discuss it. So let's do it. Chris, do you want to take the first one on income tax? Because I know you love it.
Of course. It's one of my favorite topics. So this one is an exposure draft. As Mike mentioned, it's out for comment. And so, it was issued March 15th. So just a few weeks ago, and it's out for comment. Comment deadline's May 30th. So, hey, if you want to comment on this, by all means do so. But anyway, what's this one all about? It's actually about disclosure, right? So no changes to the actual mechanics of ASC Topic 740. We're talking about disclosures, which, the whole idea is to provide more transparency to the readers of the financial statements about, the income tax situation for a company.
I always thought those tax disclosures, they're pretty good. So what's changed?
The couple of things. So the first area where they're proposing change is the rate reconciliation. Now, the rate reconciliation has been around for a long time. And if you recall, the rate reconciliation is only a requirement for public business entities, right?
Okay, yeah.
Non-public entities don't have to do a rate reconciliation. They disclose certain things. But the rate reconciliations required by public business for public business entities, that's not changing. So what I'm about to talk about is still only for public business entities. But if you look in the standard, it's only like one little paragraph about the rate rec.
Okay.
And it talks about, that you're reconciling, right, to the from the effective tax rate to the statutory rate. You can do it in dollars or percentages or both. And it says that you have to disclose in the rec significant items, reconciling items. Doesn't define what significant is. So
that's the current GAAP.
That's the current GAAP. So, so it's pretty short and sweet. And so basically what they're doing here is they're going to require more specifics about this rate reconciliation. So first major change is the rate rec will have to be done in both percentages and reporting currency, right? Not or, right? So both. Now, a lot of companies are already doing both, but that will be a requirement. In addition, they're going to require certain specific categories, regardless of the amount. You're going to have to do certain specific categories. Now, these are categories that most companies are doing anyway, but it's now required. State and local income tax, foreign tax effects, effects from enactment of new tax laws, effective cross-border tax laws, tax credits, valuation allowance, non-taxable or non-deductible items, and changes in unrecognized tax benefits. Now,
those are all separate items?
Those are all separate items. They're very commonly disclosed now because they're usually significant, but they're now required regardless. In addition to that, separate disclosure is going to be required for other reconciling items in which the reconciling item is equal to or greater than 5% of